is the year 1944. The war rages on across Europe, but far from the front lines, in the quiet heartland of America, a different kind of story unfolds, one that begins not with gunfire or explosions, but with something far more ordinary. Bread, inside sprawling prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the United States. Thousands of captured German soldiers find themselves surrounded by the very enemy they had been taught to despise. For these men, accustomed to the dense, dark loaves of rye and sourdough that had sustained them through childhood and war, the very sight of American bread was almost laughable. White, fluffy and soft, it seemed to them like a child's food, an imitation, something so far removed from the rich, hearty loaves of home that they could barely consider it bread at all. They scoffed, they sneered, they joked among themselves that America's so-called bread was nothing but tasteless air in disguise. But one day, the ovens were opened, and what emerged was not the pale, pre-sliced factory bread they had mocked from afar, but steaming golden loaves baked fresh right before their eyes. The crust cracked with a sound like breaking twigs. The air filled with a warmth so rich it silenced every laugh, every whisper, every prejudice. These hardened men, who had endured the thunder of artillery and the cold iron of captivity, were disarmed not by weapons, but by the simplest, most ancient comfort of all, bread, made fresh and offered by the very nation they once called their enemy. This is the story of how German prisoners of war, scoffing at American bread, came to taste something they would never forget. At first, the skepticism was universal. When the German prisoners of war were marched into the camp mess halls for their first meals on American soil, they encountered trays stacked with slices of bread that looked utterly foreign to them. To the Americans serving it, it was the most ordinary thing in the world, soft, uniform, and pale white, each slice machine-cut with mechanical precision. But to the eyes of men raised on dense loaves of rye, sourdough, and black bread, baked in brick ovens back in their villages, this bread appeared almost insulting. To call it bread seemed to them a misuse of the word itself. They stared at it with bemusement, and then, almost in unison, they began to laugh. The laughter was not joyous, but edged with mockery. For these men, even as captives, their cultural pride remained intact, and bread was at the very heart of that pride. In Germany, bread was not a mere side dish. It was heritage, survival, and identity. There were hundreds of varieties, each with centuries of tradition behind them, crafted by skilled bakers whose craft was passed from father to son. Bread was meant to be dark, heavy with grains, and rich in flavor. But what sat before them now was light as air, so soft it bent between their fingers, so white it looked more like cake than sustenance. They scoffed openly, exchanging sharp remarks in German, calling it Brotauswatte, cotton bread. Some pushed the slices aside. Others tore at them half-heartedly, smirking as they demonstrated how easily the pieces compressed into tiny lumps when squeezed in their fists. In their minds, this bread was symbolic. If this was what America called food, then perhaps it explained the abundance they had heard about, soft, weak, without character. They mocked it as another sign that their captors had grown comfortable in luxury, untested by the hardships that forged the German spirit. For men who had marched across battlefields, endured rationing, and fought on empty stomachs, bread had always been serious business. And now, staring down at this pale imitation, they felt almost vindicated in their disdain. But though the ridicule was loud, curiosity always lingers in silence. Some of the men remembered the smell of their village bakeries, the warmth of ovens still glowing from the early hours of dawn. Even as they joked among themselves, they could not escape the memories of crust breaking under their hands, of mothers slicing loaves on wooden boards, of butter melting into dark slices during long winter mornings. The bread before them looked nothing like that. But the longing for the true taste of bread never fully leaves a man, even in captivity. It was on one of those ordinary days, when routine meals were served as usual, that something began to shift. The camp kitchens were alive with noise, pots clattering, men moving quickly, steam rising from vats of stew, but within that commotion, something else stirred. The smell came first, faint at the beginning, then growing stronger with every passing moment. It was the smell of yeast, of dough rising, of flour baked into something alive. At first, many prisoners dismissed it as imagination, a cruel trick played on hungry minds. But the smell did not fade. It grew richer, warmer, until men began to lift their heads, their conversations faltering mid-sentence. Then they saw it. American soldiers, along with camp cooks, carried trays from ovens that glowed with fire. On the trays lay loaves, not slices, and not the soft factory bread that had been the subject of so much ridicule, but whole, golden-brown creations, their crusts gleaming, their edges cracked and crisp. The air shimmered around them, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of fresh bread. Real bread, bread that demanded respect no matter the country it came from. The prisoners' laughter stopped instantly. Eyes followed the loaves, wide, unblinking, almost childlike in their intensity, for men who had lived through hunger. For soldiers who had torn at stale rations and chewed on crusts hardened by time, the sight was overwhelming. Pride kept many of them silent, but inside a shift was taking place. They had dismissed American bread as nothing, as fluff, as empty. Yet here, in the heat of the ovens, the Americans had produced something that could not be denied. The golden sheen of those loaves carried with it a power stronger than propaganda. It carried the universal truth of food made with care. Prisoners leaned forward in their seats, straining for a better look. The sound of crust cracking as loaves were removed filled the room like the snap of kindling on a fire. Steam curled into the air, visible, fragrant, impossible to resist. The smell was almost too much. It cut through the barbed wire, the guard towers, the memories of defeat. It was a smell that belonged to home, not prison. For the first time, many of these men felt the weight of their laughter crumble, replaced by a silence that admitted what their pride would not say out loud. This bread was different. This bread was alive. The prisoners, who only minutes earlier had sneered and joked, now sat in stillness, their eyes following every tray, their breathing slowed by anticipation. Some swallowed hard. Others exchanged quick, uncertain glances. Their captors had not spoken a word, but the message was clear. Bread was not to be underestimated here. It was not only the staple of Germany, but of humanity itself, and America had just reminded them of that truth in the simplest, most profound way imaginable. The laughter was gone. In its place remained something far stronger, an unspoken recognition. They had mocked the slices, yes, but now they could not mock the loaves. And as the first pieces of freshly baked bread were broken apart, the warmth spreading across the room, the story of their pride and skepticism began to change forever. The first bites were hesitant, almost reluctant, as though surrendering to curiosity felt like surrendering to defeat itself. The trays of freshly baked loaves had silenced the mocking voices, but silence is not the same as trust. These were men hardened by years of war, men who had been taught to see their captors as enemies, not as people capable of producing something worthy of respect. To them, eating this bread was more than tasting. It was admitting that perhaps America's food was not as weak or soulless as they had believed. And so, as the loaves were broken apart and passed down the long wooden tables, the prisoners reached out slowly, their hands cautious, their expressions tense. The crust felt strange in their fingers. Unlike the soft, spongy white slices they had scorned before, this bread pushed back. Its crust was hard but not stale, crisp with a firmness that cracked beneath pressure. The warmth radiated into their palms, carrying with it a scent so rich it pulled them inward against their will. A few men glanced at each other, trying to mask their sudden eagerness. No one wanted to be the first to show vulnerability. The first bites were small, almost ceremonial. Tiny pieces torn from the edge, lifted to the lips, touched to the tongue. And then something remarkable happened. The bread dissolved with warmth, soft inside the crust, a balance of texture and flavor that was impossible to deny. The mockery that had been so loud just hours earlier collapsed under the weight of the taste itself. For the first time since captivity began, some of the men closed their eyes. The flavor was not German, not entirely familiar, but it was good, honestly, deeply good. And in that simple recognition, a flood of memory returned. They remembered mornings in their villages, waking to the smell of ovens, already glowing in the bakeries. They remembered mothers slicing thick wedges of bread and spreading them with butter. Fathers coming in from the fields to eat at heavy oak tables, laughter echoing in kitchens before the world had fallen apart. The crust cracking between their teeth brought with it more than flavor. It brought dignity. It brought comfort. It brought humanity into a place where barbed wire and armed guards had tried to strip it away. A man who had mocked the bread earlier now chewed slowly, almost reverently, while another leaned back, his expression softened by a memory too private to share. The barracks, usually filled with chatter and noise, had grown quieter still, the silence punctuated only by the sound of crust breaking, of men chewing slowly, of soldiers savoring something they had thought impossible in captivity. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. A guard, standing watch near the door, noticed the change immediately. He had seen the smirks, the contempt, the disdain that these prisoners carried like armor. But now, for the first time, he saw their shoulders ease, their faces soften. For a few moments, they were not enemy soldiers. They were simply men, tasting bread, tasting memory, tasting something that made them human again. Not every prisoner admitted the truth out loud. Pride is a heavy burden, and these men carried it even in defeat. Some muttered that the bread was tolerable. Others claimed it reminded them of certain loaves from Bavaria or Saxony, disguising their surprise as comparison. But beneath their words, the truth was clear. The bread had broken through where nothing else had. It was not luxury that mattered here, not abundance, but authenticity. And in that authenticity they found respect. Respect was not easily given by these men. They were taught to see themselves as superior, as part of a nation whose culture and traditions stood above others. Yet as they chewed, as they savored, as they swallowed, the realization grew. This bread was not beneath them. It stood alongside the traditions they had once claimed only Germany could produce. It carried the weight of craftsmanship, the proof that America could bake not just soft, factory-made imitations, but loaves that reminded them of home. Loaves that touched something deeper than hunger. The first bites gave way to larger ones. Hesitation shifted into hunger, hunger into eagerness. Soon the loaves disappeared piece by piece, leaving only crumbs on the wooden tables. Some men wiped those crumbs with their fingers, unwilling to waste even a trace. Others licked them away discreetly, as though ashamed to show how much they had enjoyed something they had mocked so fiercely. The act of eating, simple and ordinary, became profound in that moment. A prisoner at the far end of the table, a man who had once been a baker before the war stole his life away, sat still as he ate. His eyes were fixed on the bread, his face unreadable. Then quietly, almost to himself, he whispered that it was good, better than he had expected, perhaps better than he had hoped. Another prisoner near him, hearing the words, nodded silently. No one laughed now, no one scoffed. The bread had earned their respect without needing words, without needing force. The barracks air remained heavy, with the scent of the loaves long after they were gone. The men lingered at the tables, not eager to return to their bunks, as though by staying they could hold on to the warmth a little longer. It was not merely the warmth of the bread itself, but the warmth of memory, of dignity, of the reminder that they were still human beings, deserving of something real, something crafted, something good. It is difficult to imagine, for those who have never been captives, how something so small could mean so much. But for men who had been stripped of freedom, whose pride had been shattered by defeat, the simple act of eating bread that reminded them of life before the war was more powerful than any speech, any punishment, or any act of propaganda. It was food, and food does not lie. Food does not carry the weight of politics. It carries the truth of the hands that made it, the fire that baked it, the air that carried its scent. The memory of those first hesitant bites would linger in their minds long after that day. Some would recall the way they resisted at first, clinging to their pride, only to feel it dissolve with the bread on their tongues. Others would remember the smell, the sight of steam rising from the broken loaves, the way the room had fallen silent as if in reverence. For all of them, whether they admitted it openly or not, that bread was a turning point. It was the moment they realized that even in captivity, even in enemy hands, they could be reminded of home, of life, of the dignity that war had nearly erased. The first bites were hesitant, yes, but those hesitant bites became memories stronger than laughter, stronger than mockery. They became proof that respect could be found in the simplest of things, and that sometimes the most powerful victories are not won with weapons, but with bread. Word spread quickly through the camps. News in captivity did not need newspapers, radios, or official announcements. It traveled by whispers, by knowing glances, by the excited retellings of men who had discovered something worth sharing. What had begun as ridicule now became a story that prisoners repeated to each other. The Americans could bake bread, real bread, good bread, bread that reminded them of home. Men who had not been in the mess hall that first day soon heard of it, and curiosity swelled like the rising dough itself. Soon every meal carried with it a spark of expectation, the quiet hope that the ovens would once again produce those golden loaves that had silenced their laughter. When the fresh bread appeared again, the mood was entirely different. No longer did the prisoners sneer or scoff. They leaned forward eagerly, watching the trays emerge from the ovens, their faces illuminated by the steam rising from the crusts. There was no mistaking it this time. This was not weakness, not fluff, not the pale factory slices that had once been mocked. This was strength disguised as simplicity, warmth disguised as food. The first loaves had been met with hesitation, but now the prisoners reached for them with quiet eagerness, their pride tempered by the memory of that first taste. Around the long tables, men spoke more openly. Some compared the bread to the loaves of their childhood towns, rye loaves from Bavaria, sourdoughs from the Rhineland, dark breads of Saxony. Others admitted in hushed voices that it tasted better than they had expected, even better than some of the loaves they had eaten back home. It was not the same, of course, but it carried the same spirit. For men whose daily lives were now defined by fences, guards, and routine, this bread became more than food. It became a bridge, a moment that transported them back to the kitchens and bakeries of their youth. They were prisoners who had been bakers themselves before the war. They examined the loaves with a professional eye, turning them over in their hands, noting the texture, the grain, the balance of crust to softness. At first, they were silent, unwilling to praise their captors too openly. But slowly, inevitably, they nodded, acknowledging with the smallest gestures that the bread was well made. Some even admitted it aloud, that this bread was worthy of respect. For men who had once laughed with contempt, such words carried enormous weight. The transformation within the camp was subtle but profound. Bread had become a language of its own, speaking in a way that words and propaganda never could. The guards did not need to lecture the prisoners about American abundance or superiority. The loaves spoke for themselves. Each crust that cracked, each piece broken and passed along the tables, was a quiet statement that humanity existed on both sides of the war. For the prisoners, it was a reminder that even in enemy hands, life could still hold dignity, still hold echoes of home. Conversations around the tables changed. Men who had once muttered only about escape, about battles lost, about bitterness, now found themselves talking of bakeries, of family meals, of the smell of bread wafting through narrow village streets. The act of eating had become an act of remembering, and remembering softened them in ways no speech could. They laughed, not at the bread but with each other, sharing stories of their mothers, their wives, their childhood homes. A warmth spread through the barracks that was not only from the food, but from the memories it stirred. Even the guards noticed the change. They had grown used to the prisoners' arrogance, to the sharp words in German that were often muttered under breath. But now, as the prisoners ate, they saw smiles, softer expressions, and a silence filled not with defiance, but with reverence. For a few minutes during each meal, the war felt far away. There were no battles, no enemies, no fences, only men and bread, and the fragile thread of humanity that connected them. The bread became a symbol. To the prisoners, it was proof that America was not the soulless industrial giant they had imagined, but a nation with traditions and crafts of its own. To the Americans, it was a small act of decency, a way to show that even in victory there was room for humanity. No one spoke of it openly, yet everyone felt it. Each loaf carried with it something larger than food. It carried respect, dignity, and the possibility of reconciliation. In time, the memory of that bread would outlast the war itself. Years later, when many of these prisoners returned home to Germany, they would tell their families and friends not only of the hardships of captivity, but of the surprising kindnesses, the unexpected moments that reminded them of their humanity. They would recall the taste of American bread baked fresh in camp ovens, the bread they had once mocked but later cherished. Some would speak of it with nostalgia, others with amazement, but all would remember it. For bread, once dismissed, had become unforgettable. In those camps, behind barbed wire and guard towers, bread did what speeches and orders could not. It reminded enemies that they were still men, still human, still connected by the simplest of needs and the most enduring of traditions. In the end, the bread was more than food. It was memory, it was respect, it was a bridge between two worlds torn apart by war. And as the golden loaves emerged from the ovens, glowing in the light, the German prisoners understood that even in defeat, there could be moments of dignity, moments of comfort. moments that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The story of the bread spread not only within a single camp, but across multiple ones. Prisoners transferred from one camp to another brought the tale with them, carrying it like a rumor but speaking of it with a reverence usually reserved for much greater things. "They can bake bread," they would say, half in disbelief, half in admiration. The tale always carried the same arc: mockery at first, then silence, then respect. It became part of the folklore of captivity, a story men would whisper to those who had not yet tasted it, building anticipation, building hope. That hope mattered more than most realized. Captivity was a slow erosion of spirit, a daily grind of waiting, of confinement, of lost identity. But when hope could be tied to something so simple, so tangible as bread, it gave men a reason to endure. For a while, they were not prisoners defined by loss, but men waiting for the next loaf, the next chance to taste something that belonged to life before the war. The bread, in its own quiet way, lessened the hatred. It did not erase it entirely. War scars run too deep for that, but it softened it. It showed that enemies could still share something as basic as food, and in sharing, find respect. The bread blurred the lines between captor and captive. The prisoners no longer laughed at America's food. They respected it, even admired it. And in that shift, something larger was achieved. The recognition that culture, tradition, and humanity exist on both sides of every conflict, for years to come. Long after the fences came down and the prisoners returned to their homelands, the memory of that bread remained vivid. In kitchens across Germany, when families gathered to bake their own loaves, some men would tell their children about the time they tasted bread in an American camp. Bread that had silenced their pride. Bread that had reminded them of home, even in a foreign land. It was a story that carried with it humility, surprise, and the quiet lesson that enemies are not always what they seem. The scoffing had given way to silence. The silence had given way to respect, and the respect had given way to memory. Memory that endured, memory that still lingers in the stories of those who lived it.